What lessons can be drawn from Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to draft Russian men to fight his war in Ukraine? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom. This is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for the libertarian philosophy, especially within the context of what's going on in the world. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, it's good to see you survived Hurricane Ian. I can speak on behalf of our viewers that we were concerned about you with your absence last week as you were fleeing Hurricane Ian and going to parts of South Carolina that were safer. So I'm glad you made it out okay.
Yes, unfortunately, it did not hit our area as directly as had been predicted might be the case. So no damage, no serious effects in the community. And so life goes on.
All right. Well, fantastic. If you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org for around 3 decades worth of principled arguments in favor of liberty. Excuse me. And of course, subscribe to our FFF Daily, which is free. Subscribe to our monthly journal, which is not free, but well worth the cost. And of course, to our YouTube channel and our books. Okay, Richard. So one of the big burning issues that has occurred in the last few weeks in the context of the Russian war on Ukraine has been the fact that President Putin and I guess we would call it the military-industrial complex of Russia, have now resorted to conscription, or more commonly known as the draft. And they're essentially forcing young Russian men to come and serve the government by going to Ukraine and being put in a position of kill or be killed. And it's interesting because, or one interesting aspect of it is that a lot of Russian men are fleeing the country, and they haven't closed the border apparently. And so you've got these long lines of people at the borders of different countries surrounding Russia that are trying to get out. In other words, draft evaders, draft dodgers. And what's interesting is that the U.S. mainstream press kind of looks at these guys as, doing the right thing because Russia's involved in this illegitimate war, and there's no condemnation, from what I can tell, in the U.S. mainstream press of these draft dodgers. They report on their activities, they profile them, they interview them, they analyze them, but there's no condemnation. Unlike the fact that during the U.S. war on Vietnam in the 1960s, the attitude of the mainstream press was completely different. That during that war, we, the United States, also had conscription. That American men were being forcibly taken from their homes through military orders and made to go and report to a military facility where they would be trained so that they could go to Vietnam or be sent to Vietnam and, like those Russian soldiers, be put in a position of kill or be killed. And at that time, I mean, they were called every name in the books by the mainstream press and by the supporters of the Pentagon, the supporters of the war, cowards. I mean, that was one of the most famous words, cowards and cowardice. And most of these guys were fleeing to Canada and saying, they were saying essentially the same thing as the Russian soldiers are saying. This war doesn't pertain to us. We want no part of it. We're not ready to go die in this senseless war of yours. But the attitude here was exactly the same attitude that Putin is taking toward the soldiers over there. And one of the most famous examples involved Muhammad Ali. And he says, he got drafted, and he said, I'm not going. One of his most famous lines was, I got nothing against those Viet Cong. Well, that just infuriated the Pentagon and the military intelligence establishment. I mean, you don't say those kind of things. When they adopt an official enemy like the communists or the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, everybody's supposed to get on board and say that's my official enemy too. And the irony was that they were telling these soldiers that American soldiers in Vietnam, they were being sent to Vietnam, but they were fighting for freedom. And that was a hard thing for a lot of blacks, many of whom were being disproportionately drafted because they didn't have the money to go to college and get the deferments that the rich kids were getting. They had a hard time processing that they were fighting and dying for freedom over there, when over here they were getting hosed and beaten and killed for opposing segregation laws. It's a strange dichotomy. But in any event, I think this has valuable lessons for us here, Richard, and especially for American young people. They're still required to register for the draft, and they think, well, oh, it's just an innocuous act, no big deal, I'm just sending in a registration. They don't realize that that list and that registration serves the exact same purpose as it does in Russia. That when they need you to be their cannon fodder, they've got the information as to where to find you, and as soon as they serve you with that draft notice, you are required to report to a military installation within a certain period of time. And that's why it's so important that American young people pay attention to this. I mean, there should be no draft registration at all, because it really is the first step in a draft. What do you think?
Well, let me sort of fill in some of the details of what you were saying about the situation in Russia. First, there is required military service. You can get college deferments and things like that, their version of college deferments. But there is wide requirement of young people to do a certain period of military service. And that's why when they said they were mobilizing up to 300,000 people, they publicly said that this would be drawing upon those who had had some military experience in the past. That didn't mean combat. Didn't mean that you had been fighting the Soviet war in Afghanistan, or the Russian military intervention in Syria or something, or even necessarily the more recent takeover with little green men of the Crimea back in 2014. It just meant that you had had sufficient active military training during your required stint in the military, if you had not had one of these deferments, that you could more easily be sort of given a refresher course to go into the meat grinder. Now, the other thing that's worth pointing out is that the arbitrariness of this, and by which I mean, and you touched upon a little bit on the disproportionality of people from the American Black community who ended up serving in Vietnam. It's very interesting to note that very few young men who have been serving in the Russian military up till now, but who come from either Moscow or St. Petersburg, have been fighting in Ukraine. Most of the Russian military units sent into combat up till now have come from areas of the country far away from the two municipal areas of Russia, where there's the potential for vocal opposition, more sort of intellectual resistance, and a high proportion of, in the Russian context, minority groups. Right? You know, there are Asians. There are their version of Eskimos. There are their versions of Central Asians. And these people have been more than proportionally ending up fighting in these invaded parts of Ukraine. And even now, part of the stink outside of Moscow and Petersburg is that there's been an attempt to round up even more of these young people from these minority groups, ethnic and other type of minority groups, to suck them into this war. But the other thing is that where have most of the people come from who are now fleeing Russia, as you said? And a high percentage are young professionals, educated, technical skills, all of whom have had these deferments. They maybe had done like a year's service of basic training, but they've not served in the military. And or they had the sort of a minimal amount of it with doing their university work. And now they're all threatened with being called up. And this is what is causing this huge opposition and resistance. Now, the one particular difference, I should say, between the experience during the Vietnam War here at home and in Russia today is that, there were violence on campuses. There were wide demonstrations against the draft. The police used extraordinary force at times. But you see, there, just for demonstrating against the war, criticizing the war, that itself can set you up for anywhere from 10 to 15 years in prison. Now, it's estimated that about 2,500 Russian demonstrators have already been arrested. And it'll be very interesting to see how many of them get these long sentences if they don't comply in some other ways with what the Russian government wants. But the other thing I would want to point out about this is that during the Vietnam War, there was all of this opposition on campuses, the general population. And as you were saying, it's because many Americans wondered, why are we fighting this war? It's 10,000 miles away. The Vietnamese don't seem particularly enthusiastic about America coming to their country. And at the height of our participation, there was over 500,000 military personnel on the ground in Vietnam, which means the support, the logistical support to sustain that type of force on the ground was a couple of million. And the Americans just saying, why am I being sent? Or why is my son being sent? Why is my husband being sent? Why is my young neighbor being sent to fight a war that doesn't seem to be in any way involving the defense of the United States? If the communists take over Vietnam, it may be a tragedy, but they claim they're not communists. They're just, nationalists. But what has that got to do with the United States? Now compare that to Afghanistan and Iraq. Have there been opposition to these two wars? Yes. Has it been wide and pervasive and outspoken as had occurred during the Vietnam War? No. And I think that was because the powers that be in Washington, D.C. had learned their lesson. Do not conscript people who don't want to fight in these wars that we've decided is in the national interest of the United States. We've had a volunteer army. So if you sign up, you know that you could be volunteering to be put into harm's way. And that's why instead of American soldiers coming back from Vietnam as the rotations were occurring, and people calling them baby killers and spitting on them as they were getting home off the planes and the ships and so on and so forth. Thank you for your service. We're so proud of you. And the authorities in Washington got away with a lot more of this for 20 years, a 20-year war in Afghanistan, precisely because they had the smarts, that is, the realpolitik smarts, not to try to do this with a conscript army. The resistance would have been there against Vietnam and Iraq more intensely if it had been those who had not volunteered to be put into harm's way. So in that sense, the Washington authorities were much more savvy than Putin is showing out to be.
Yeah, you've raised a lot of good points. When you talk about the Russian conscription of these people in the outlying areas, I mean, you're talking about poor people, people of minorities, and that's precisely what was happening during the Vietnam War too. I mean, they gave the deferments to the rich kids, and so the black kids, the kids in the inner cities, the Hispanic kids, they couldn't afford to go to college, and so they were ripe for being conscripted. And so there was a much bigger disproportionate share of blacks and Hispanics in that war getting killed than the rich white kids, compared to the percentage of the population. I think it's important that we talk about just the principle of conscription. I mean, what's happening here is that in a genuinely free society, you are free to live your life any way you want, so long as your conduct is peaceful. That's the core principle of libertarianism. As long as you're not murdering, raping, stealing, defrauding people and the like, you're free to just go about living your life. And in fact, the 13th Amendment makes it expressly clear that there will not be involuntary servitude, that nobody's going to be required to serve anybody else, including the state, which was what slavery was all about. I mean, that's the real core issue in slavery, that people are being forced to serve others through the force of law, not through just a voluntary contract between employer and employee. Well, that is precisely what conscription does. It forces somebody to serve the state. In other words, the master-servant relationship is totally upended. It's no longer a free society. A free society is where the government serves you, and you are never forced to serve the government. Conscription changes that completely. It requires the citizen to serve the state. And let's face it, Richard, that in a truly defensive war, you wouldn't have to conscript anybody. Oh, sure, there'd be some people that were kind of like freeloading as people were defending the country from an invasion. But by and large, I think 98% of American people would fight against an invader, resist it. Well, if these wars were really so good, like Russia's war in Ukraine or America's war in Vietnam or Afghanistan or wherever, you wouldn't need to force people. The fact that they were forcing people to go to Vietnam tells you that it was a bad war right there, because people have a better sense of what's in their own interest, best interest, than the state does, which of course treats these people as sacrificial pawns. But this mindset of involuntary servitude has become so pervasive. You know, a variation of this is national service, which you keep seeing government officials raising. The mainstream press is that why shouldn't young people be forced to serve society, to serve the state? It's really no different from Putin's conscription order. Over there, of course, they're conscripting to go fight in war, but in principle, it's the same. You're conscripting young people, you're forcing people to go and serve the state, even if it's not to go kill people, it's to serve the state in some way. Involuntary servitude, people being forced to serve others against their will. And that's why it's so important that we keep concentrating in terms of what a free society is, which of course we've been doing at FFF for some 30 years. And if we lose sight of what a genuinely free society is all about, then people are all too willing to go along with this type of anti-freedom nonsense.
Now, let me ask you something, Jacob. Now, the Future Freedom Foundation is an NGO, a charitable, non-governmental organization. You mean you wouldn't want the government, under a national service mandate, to assign a few young people to do their service working for you at FFF?
Well, let me answer that question seriously. I think the only way I would justify it if they were forcing you to work for FFF. I think that would be justified because you would be fighting for freedom. So what's wrong with denying your freedom if you're advancing freedom?
In fact, that perversely, and however, sarcastically, that is perversely the entire justification of government during times of national crisis. We must weaken or abolish a variety of freedoms in the name of fighting for freedom. We want a free society. So in wartime, like during the First World War and the Second World War, we have to place the entire economy under government central planning, wage controls, price controls, government mandated direction of production to serve the war effort. The various people must pay a larger share in taxes to cover the war expenditures. So you have to give up more of what you've honestly earned to save your freedom, along with having less personal liberty at the same time. This is the mindset that somehow you preserve freedom by taking away freedom. And as a number of people have pointed out historically, once you go through those episodes of national emergencies, when the crisis has passed, yes, often like in the United States, a variety of the rules, regulations, controls are reduced or abolished. But the net situation that remains is that the government has a larger presence and controlling place in the society than before the crisis occurs, like a ratchet effect. Each crisis results in government being left at the end of the crisis with more control and influence and power over people's lives. And this idea of national service is one of them, because basically what the government is saying is that young people between a certain age should be mandated under government planning to have to serve in these types of charitable associations. Now, realistically, would they say, well, what should be FFF's quota of national service youth? They wouldn't give it to FFF. You know, they would want to assign it politically to those organizations, those purposes, those goals that they viewed as politically correct based upon the ideological currents and pressures and influences of the time. It is basically the imposition of central planning over people's lives by enforced servitude. Precedent.
Are you still there? I lost
Yes,
you for a second.
I'm still here.
I couldn't agree with you more. That, in fact, the whole Cold War, Richard, really was about destroying Americans' freedom in order to supposedly protect our freedom from a communist takeover. When you look at the conversion of the federal government to a national security state, the real justification here is that we can't beat the Reds with a limited government republic, because they're exercising secret powers, omnipotent powers, powers of assassination, coups, secret surveillance. We need all these powers, massive military industrial complex. In other words, the argument is we need to become like them in order to defeat them. And so what's the point of this? You're gonna destroy your own freedom in the hopes of getting freedom back at some indefinite time in the future. And of course, even when the Cold War ended, the limited government republic wasn't restored. We're still sitting with the same Cold War apparatus and actually the same Cold War mindset that we've been in since 1945. And you mentioned that Putin is putting people in jail for criticizing the draft. Well, let's not forget that that's precisely what was happening here in the United States in World War I. They were putting people into jail. Now, here was an intervention in a European war that really had nothing to do with the United States. This was President Wilson's plan that, boy, we're going to use American power to bring an end to all European wars. This will be the final war, and we're going to make the world safe for democracy. And to make sure that nobody opposed this ridiculous mindset, they started prosecuting people. They made it illegal to criticize the war effort, to criticize the draft, and they put people away for long periods of time, just like Putin's doing. And so that power still exists. It's a standby power. You're right. They didn't exercise it a lot in Vietnam and during the Vietnam War, but they still were going on college campuses and going after people. We know about the shootings at Kent State. We know that how they hated the protests around the Pentagon and so forth. I mean, they viewed anti-war protesters as the enemy, as pro-communists, that they were North Vietnamese sympathizers. It was never this sense of, hey, the protesters are doing the right thing. And as it turned out, the protesters were doing the right thing. If it hadn't been for the protests, we'd probably still be in Vietnam today, losing American soldiers and destroying their society. The protesters are really the ones that brought an early end to that war, and which, of course, never should have been there in the first place. So again, I reiterate that if we're going to achieve a free society, we can't just be looking at Russia this and Russia that and Russia this. We really need to be focusing on the entity that has destroyed our freedom. You know, the thing is, Russia has never taken any right or freedom that I have. Never. Neither has China. The U.S. government has. And that's why I continue to focus on the entity that has destroyed my freedom, not on foreign entities that are doing something maybe bad over there, but they're not taking away my freedom here at home.
Well, I think what's important in all of this is to realize that you know, conscription denies the individual the central freedom of deciding how he wants to live his life. It's also involuntary servitude at a wage that the government sets. How would you feel if you were looking for a job and an employer suddenly comes out onto the street and drags you into his place of business and says, I've decided I need you to perform this task in my enterprise, and this is the salary I'm going to pay you. And you have to show up every day, or otherwise I'm going to then go to the police and have you arrested and thrown into jail. And there's no negotiation about the wage you're going to receive. But that's how the military has worked with conscription. They took you forcibly under the threat of imprisonment and made you serve. And could you even negotiate over what do you consider a worthwhile monetary value to you risking or losing your life? No. They then set what your wage is going to be. So it is conscription with wage controls. You can't even negotiate the price of your servitude.
That's an excellent point. And you know, I mentioned, Richard, earlier that young people have a vested interest in getting this draft registration abolished. And Congress could do that. They could end it tomorrow, which they should do, but then destroy all the lists so that the government doesn't know where everybody is. And otherwise, if they keep the list, the effect is the same. But also to just end conscription permanently. Now, you would have thought the 13th Amendment did that, but obviously it didn't. So maybe we ought to be thinking in terms of a new amendment abolishing and prohibiting conscription forever expressly. But there's another factor here. Parents have a vested interest in this too, and so do grandparents. That you mentioned that the reason there isn't widespread opposition to Afghanistan and Iraq is that there's no draft there. There's no question, that's absolutely correct. But I think there's another factor here, that so many Americans in their middle age and in their senior years are on the dole that they have a tendency not to oppose the government at fundamental levels. I mean, look at our generation, you know, the big anti-war protests during the Vietnam War and stuff. Where do you see seniors protesting against Afghanistan, Iraq? Oh yeah, they're expressing dissatisfaction with Putin, but when their own government's doing the invading and occupying, they are silent. And my hunch is that the reason is because they're on the dole. This is why the dole society is so effective. Social Security, Medicare. I mean, if they start challenging the government in mass numbers, what if the government takes away their dole? Or you look at the military largesse spread all across this country. I mean, it boggles the mind to think how many people are directly or indirectly dependent on all these military bases and all these weapon systems and the military industrial complex. Well, when you get so many people dependent on the dole, it becomes more in their interest to just stay quiet, go with the system in order to maintain their dole. But they have a vested interest here, Richard, because they got children of draft age and they got grandchildren of draft age. And that's why they ought to be protesting against draft registration. You can't wait till the crisis when all of a sudden the Pentagon starts sending out the draft notices. At that point, it's too late because everybody's all hyped up over the crisis, like in Russia. They've got to do it now in peace, relative peacetime, where they have a chance to get it repealed under a logical, rational way of thinking in society. Waiting for the crisis ain't going to do anything. That's why parents and grandparents and young people all ought to be rallying together here to get this Russia-like conscription here in America, the draft registration, ended immediately.
I just underlined something that you said in passing a minute ago, and that is the extent to which so many areas of the country are in either direct or indirect ways dependent upon military expenditures. The Pentagon spends nearly $1 trillion a year. I believe it was like $750 billion. But remember, that's not counting all of the allocated funds that the government permits clandestinely. The CIA budget is not really publicized. The NSC, the National Security, is not completely publicized. They have slush funds for various interventions and clandestine activities abroad. So it is not far from the truth to say that approximately $1 trillion a year is spent on the military or intelligence or other related activities. That's a lot of business for armaments contractors, for suppliers of logistical equipment, for the local communities where military bases are situated. That itself is a welfare state. You know, we talk about the warfare welfare state. The military is a huge welfare state that is centrally planned and centrally determined by the state. There's no price mechanism there. Do we have too much defense? Do we have too little defense? Do we have just the right amount of defense? We know what the right amount of shoes or hats or bananas are in a society where you have it competitively determined by market supply and demand and coordinated by a price. But since this is a government monopoly, a nationalized segment of the economy, we don't know what would hypothetically be the right amount for a rational and reasonable national defense. So it's just this huge spending determined by politicians, ideologues, and vast special interests who eat at these troughs that make a lot of people in the United States dependent upon nothing draining the trough.
No, that's an excellent point. And in fact, it's a nice segue to wrap up the show today, but by talking about our online conference. I just read where the national debt, the federal government's debt, has now broken the $31 trillion level. I mean, that's incredible. You and I have been talking about this for 32 years, this massive federal spending and debt. And of course, that's the root of the inflation, because then the Federal Reserve has to print all this money to pay off the debt. And so you've got this monetary debauchery that's been going on for decades, and that's the theme of our conference. In fact, if you didn't tune in last night, Richard Ebeling was our first speaker, delivered an absolutely excellent talk, introductory talk to our conference. I invite you to listen to it if you weren't there. There was some good discussion. The talks last about an hour. And we're going to be doing this every week on Monday evenings at 7 p.m. Next week we've got Dr. Murray Sabrin, fantastic speaker. He's had tremendous conferences up in his college in New Jersey. I've participated in those great programs. He's got at least 2 books on the Federal Reserve, one called The Federal Reserve Sucks or something like that, and then another one on the boom bust cycle with respect to the Fed policies. So tune in. I mean, it's already a fantastic conference with Richard kicking it off. So thank you, Richard, for the great talk last night.
Thank you. And I just was thinking that when FFF was established back in around 1990, the U.S. national debt was barely $1 trillion. And over all the years that FFF has existed, that debt is now over $31 trillion. I hope the connection between FFF and national debt is a correlation and not a causation.
Yeah, I was concerned that you're blaming this on us. Well, all we can do is just continue speaking the truth and calling these people out for what they're doing and trying to move this country in a better direction, both with respect to conscription as well as a free market monetary system and all the rest that we do here at FFF. So on that note, Richard, we need to wrap things up. Thank you again for tuning in. Thanks for your support of FFF. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.